Before you hear the statement that shocked the world, you need to understand this. Royal families are trained never to speak plainly. They survive on ambiguity, silence, and time. So when a future king abandons all three at once, it means something has gone terribly wrong. What you're about to hear wasn't a misunderstanding, a family argument, or a moment of anger. It was a calculated decision, one that permanently altered the course of the British monarchy.
I think stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit.
In a move that sent unmistakable shockwaves through royal observers and audiences across the world, Prince William stepped firmly out of the background and delivered a statement of such clarity and resolve that it extinguished every remaining question about Meghan Markle's future within the British royal family. This was not a gentle clarification, nor a carefully managed pause wrapped in diplomatic language. It was a decisive conclusion. A door that many believed had been deliberately left ajar, kept open for negotiation, reconciliation, or time, was closed in full view of the world and closed for good. There was no ambiguity in the tone, no space for reinterpretation, no hint of future reconsideration. As the statement reverberated across headlines and broadcasts, it became clear that the future king had made a deliberate choice. Clarity over caution, permanence over possibility, and institutional duty over personal sentiment. In that moment, tradition yielded to decisiveness, and restraint gave way to a rare, unfiltered finality that would redefine the boundaries of the monarchy itself. What forces could possibly drive a man long defined by restraint, patience, and an almost instinctive discipline to abandon caution and speak with such blunt, unmistakable authority? What unseen pressures could build to such an extent that they would compel him to issue a declaration carrying consequences so permanent that they would reshape not only his own family's future, but the very framework of the monarchy itself? This was not the familiar pattern of private disagreement quietly contained behind palace walls, nor a dispute left to soften through silence, distance, or the passage of time. It was something far more consequential. It was a public judgment, delivered without hedging or retreat, spoken in a tone rarely heard from a senior royal, and broadcast deliberately to the world. In that moment, ambiguity was stripped away entirely. A line was drawn with precision and finality, visible to allies, critics, and the public alike, and it signaled that certain boundaries, once crossed, could never be reopened or renegotiated again. From the steady rise of diplomatic unease on the international stage to the deeply personal sacrifices unfolding quietly within palace walls, this moment did not arrive suddenly, nor did it emerge from a single dramatic event. It was shaped slowly, deliberately, over months, perhaps even years, of accumulating tension, unresolved conflict, and emotional strain that was rarely acknowledged in public, but deeply felt behind the scenes. Each compromise made in the name of stability carried its own cost. Each silence, intended to preserve dignity or buy time, allowed pressure to build further. Small fractures widened, unresolved questions lingered, and consequences once considered manageable grew heavier with every passing season. But here's what most headlines missed, and why this story goes far deeper than a single statement. Prince William didn't act because of one incident. He acted because multiple warning signs converged at the same time. Threats, pressure, legal risk, diplomatic concern, and something far more personal. And once you understand what pushed him past the point of silence, the finality of his decision will make chilling sense.
I am optimistic. I'm generally a very optimistic person.
The British monarchy did not stumble blindly into this moment, nor was it caught off guard by fate or circumstance. It was pushed here, step by careful step, by a convergence of forces that steadily narrowed the range of acceptable choices. Institutional expectations collided with personal loyalties. Diplomatic responsibilities clashed with private pain. Public scrutiny intensified as patience wore thin, leaving fewer places to hide and fewer solutions that did not carry significant cost. Over time, it became clear that delay itself was a decision, and one that threatened greater damage than action. By the time this crossroads was reached, the path behind had already closed, and the forces driving the monarchy forward could no longer be ignored, resisted, or postponed without consequence. The morning of December 2, 2024, marked a defining chapter in modern royal history, one that would be remembered not for ceremony or celebration, but for its quiet severity and lasting consequence. On that day, Prince William took the extraordinary and highly unusual step of personally issuing a public statement, an act so rare for a senior royal that it instantly conveyed the gravity of the moment. This was not a message delegated to aides or softened through institutional language. It came directly from him, signaling that the matter had reached a point where clarity could no longer be deferred. The message itself left no room for interpretation or hopeful speculation. There would be no pathway, neither formal nor informal, for Meghan Markle to return to royal life in any capacity. No transitional arrangement quietly discussed behind closed doors. No symbolic gesture designed to suggest reconciliation. No future reconsideration left dangling as a possibility. With deliberate precision, every potential avenue was closed, and the finality of the declaration made clear that this was not a pause, a warning, or a temporary measure. It was an endpoint. Unlike the palace's customary communications, typically filtered through carefully measured phrasing, diplomatic restraint, and intentional ambiguity, this announcement carried Prince William's unmistakable authority. It was not softened by layers of institutional language or obscured by strategic vagueness. His direct and personal involvement underscored the seriousness of the decision and stripped away any possibility of reinterpretation, revision, or quiet retreat. The message was meant to stand exactly as delivered, without caveat or condition. Within minutes of its release, newsrooms across the globe erupted with disbelief. Headlines multiplied, broadcasters interrupted programming, and social media ignited with immediate reaction. Even veteran royal correspondents, long accustomed to the palace's careful choreography, described the moment as unprecedented. Many noted that such clarity, so direct, so final, from a senior royal, was virtually unheard of in modern times, marking a rare departure from tradition and signaling a fundamental shift in how the monarchy was prepared to assert its boundaries. The impact of the statement extended far beyond the gates of the palace and the immediate circle of royal observers. According to reporting cited by Cosmopolitan, insiders made it clear that Prince William's position toward the Sussexes had hardened beyond repair. From his perspective, their continued association with the monarchy no longer carried meaningful value, neither symbolically nor institutionally. What might once have been treated as a deeply personal family rupture, open to reconciliation or quiet compromise, had transformed into something far more consequential. At this stage, the issue was no longer driven by emotion, sentiment, or private grievance. It had become a matter of public accountability, structural integrity, and long-term survival of the institution itself. Every unresolved ambiguity risked setting a precedent. Every concession risked weakening the monarchy's authority and coherence. For William, this was about establishing a clear historical record, protecting the institution from future instability, and ensuring that the boundaries drawn would endure. The decision was no longer shaped by feelings. It was shaped by permanence, precedent, and the unyielding demands of responsibility. William's personal intervention sent an unmistakable and powerful signal. The monarchy was drawing a firm, non-negotiable boundary, and that boundary would not be tested again. By stepping forward himself, he removed any illusion that the decision might later be softened, revised, or quietly undone. This was not a trial measure or a temporary stance. It was a line set in place with deliberate authority. Public reaction unfolded swiftly and unevenly. Some responded with stunned disbelief, struggling to grasp the permanence of the moment, while others expressed quiet approval, viewing the clarity as long overdue. Yet beneath the surface reactions and headline-driven debate lay a far deeper story, one not shaped by a single event, but by months of relentless pressure accumulating behind closed doors. Forces unseen by the public had been building steadily, tightening with each passing incident, until silence was no longer sustainable and decisive action became the only remaining path forward. Throughout much of 2024, the royal family found itself quietly grappling with a series of escalating complications linked directly to the Sussex situation, complications that grew more complex and more difficult to manage with each passing month. What initially appeared manageable behind the scenes refused to stay contained. These issues began seeping into every layer of palace life, affecting daily operations, disrupting carefully planned public engagements, and complicating long-term strategic planning for the monarchy's future. As internal strain increased, media scrutiny intensified to an unprecedented level. Negative narratives surfaced with remarkable timing, often emerging at moments that appeared far from accidental. Stories would break just as major royal initiatives were underway, reigniting controversy and shifting focus away from official duties. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore, reinforcing the sense that these developments were not random byproducts of public curiosity, but part of a sustained pressure that the monarchy could no longer quietly absorb or dismiss. Royal analysts began to notice a troubling and increasingly difficult pattern to dismiss. Stories that cast fresh shadows over the monarchy seemed to surface with striking precision, appearing at the very moments when senior royals, most notably Catherine, were undertaking high-profile initiatives or public engagements intended to highlight stability, service, and continuity. Rather than fading with time, these narratives repeatedly redirected attention, disrupting carefully planned appearances and shifting public focus at critical junctures.
I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me.
Kinsey Schofield noted that palace teams had grown steadily more convinced that this timing was not accidental. Internally, the repetition raised alarms. While Prince William traveled abroad on official duties, reports would suddenly emerge placing Meghan Markle back into the media spotlight, reigniting controversy just as the monarchy sought to project unity and forward momentum. Each resurgence followed a familiar rhythm, undoing weeks of preparation in a single news cycle. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore, reinforcing the belief within palace circles that these moments were strategically aligned to exert pressure, destabilize narratives, and undermine the institution at its most visible and vulnerable points. These incidents were not brushed aside as coincidence or dismissed as the inevitable noise that accompanies public life. Within palace walls, a different interpretation had taken hold. Insiders increasingly believed these moments reflected coordinated efforts to destabilize the institution itself, deliberate disruptions aimed at throwing the monarchy off balance and fracturing its carefully maintained rhythm. What appeared externally as isolated headlines began to look internally like a pattern with intent, one that exploited timing and visibility to maximum effect. Catherine's growing unease marked a crucial turning point in how these developments were understood. In a private and candid conversation with William, she articulated what had slowly become undeniable to her. This was no longer organic gossip driven by public fascination or media competition. The consistency, timing, and impact pointed to something more calculated. She made clear that these narratives were not merely distracting or frustrating, they were strategic. What the palace was facing, she warned, was not chance controversy, but intentional media interference designed to erode focus, credibility, and stability at the most vulnerable moments. The strain reached far beyond headlines, public debate, and the shifting tides of perception. Behind the scenes, legal advisors began sounding increasingly urgent alarms about the dangers of prolonged ambiguity. Unclear relationships, they warned, created structural vulnerabilities, openings for future claims, disputes, or costly misunderstandings that could resurface years later and destabilize the institution at critical moments. What remained undefined today risked becoming a legal and constitutional problem tomorrow. At the same time, security planning grew steadily more complicated. When roles and statuses remained unresolved, protocols became harder to enforce and easier to challenge. Every public appearance, international engagement, or travel arrangement carried added risk when responsibility and entitlement were not clearly established. What had once been manageable through informal understanding now demanded formal resolution. The longer uncertainty persisted, the greater the exposure became, reinforcing the conclusion that ambiguity itself had turned into a liability the monarchy could no longer afford to carry. King Charles, already contending with personal health challenges, and the heavy, unfamiliar demands of the early stage of his reign, found himself caught in an almost impossible position. As a father, his affection for his son remained real and deeply rooted. Yet as monarch, he was increasingly forced to confront a harsher reality. The institution could not be governed by emotion, and it could not be protected through hope alone. The more the situation lingered, the more it threatened to erode the structure he was sworn to uphold. That collision between private love and public duty placed him under strain that few outside the palace could fully understand. Every decision carried consequence. Every delay carried risk. And the longer the uncertainty remained unresolved, the more it weakened the monarchy's ability to project stability, authority, and continuity. An institution built on tradition and order cannot function indefinitely in a fog of ambiguity. Sooner or later, what remains unclear becomes unmanageable. For Charles, the dilemma was not simply painful, it was structural. The monarchy could not move forward while such a significant question remained hanging in the air. As media pressure intensified, security risks escalated, legal exposure widened, and concerns over royal health continued to mount. A stark realization took hold within the palace. Silence was no longer a viable strategy. What had once been managed through restraint, carefully worded statements, and quiet endurance could no longer contain the accumulating damage. Each attempt to delay resolution only deepened uncertainty and invited further strain. Vagueness, once a tool of preservation, had become a liability. The cost of inaction now outweighed the consequences of decision. With every factor converging at once, the margin for hesitation disappeared. Decisive action was no longer a matter of choice or timing. It had become inevitable, driven not by impulse, but by necessity. Amid this growing turbulence, Catherine's role became increasingly central to understanding the true depth of the crisis. Her lived experience offered a level of clarity that no briefing, report, or strategic assessment could fully capture. She was not observing events from a distance. She was living through their consequences in real time. Again and again, she noticed how negative narratives emerged in precise alignment with her public efforts, appearing just as initiatives were launched or important engagements were underway. To Catherine, the pattern was impossible to ignore. These moments did not merely undermine the monarchy in abstract terms. They struck directly at her work, her credibility, and the causes she championed. What had once seemed like background noise revealed itself as something more deliberate, more targeted. Through her experience, it became clear that the pressure was not only institutional, but personal, aimed at weakening both the public face of the monarchy and the individual contributions that sustained its relevance and trust. In early November, Catherine shared these observations with William in a moment of unfiltered honesty, setting aside protocol and restraint to speak plainly about what she was experiencing. The constant barrage of scrutiny and hostility, she explained, was no longer merely exhausting or emotionally draining. It had begun to erode something far more fundamental: their family's sense of safety, stability, and emotional security. What had once been endured as part of public life was now intruding into their private world. William's response was immediate and deeply personal. Watching the cumulative effects of relentless scrutiny on his wife, and seeing how that pressure extended toward their children, stirred a protective urgency that went beyond institutional strategy or public optics. In that moment, his role as a husband and father eclipsed every other consideration. The situation was no longer an abstract challenge to be managed. It was a direct threat to the well-being of those he was determined to protect, and it demanded a response that transcended calculation and compromise. Conversations with Catherine, layered with the reality of his father's ongoing struggles and the steadily increasing attention directed toward his own children, fundamentally reshaped William's understanding of the crisis. Each element reinforced the same conclusion from a different angle. What had once been approached as a challenge of public perception, media balance, and institutional image could no longer be framed in those terms alone. The impact was no longer distant or abstract. It was personal, immediate, and deeply felt within his own household.
I'm so proud of my wife and my father for how they've handled all of last year. My children have managed brilliantly as well.
In that realization, the focus shifted decisively. This was no longer about managing optics, containing headlines, or preserving appearances for the sake of tradition. It was about protection. It was about drawing boundaries strong enough to shield the people he loved most from ongoing strain, uncertainty, and harm. The responsibility he felt was no longer theoretical or inherited. It was instinctive, grounded in family, and impossible to ignore. Behind the scenes, legal advisors undertook a comprehensive and meticulous review of Meghan Markle's ambiguous status within the royal framework, examining every potential vulnerability that prolonged uncertainty could create. Their conclusions were unequivocal and sobering. Unclear boundaries, they warned, expose the monarchy to a range of escalating risks. Legal complications that could invite future claims, security challenges that blurred responsibility and protection, reputational damage that eroded public confidence, and even constitutional questions that threatened long-term institutional coherence. From the legal team's perspective, ambiguity itself had become the danger. Each unresolved detail increased exposure, not just in the present moment, but years into the future, when precedent and interpretation could resurface in unpredictable ways. The recommendation they delivered was firm and uncompromising. Ambiguity had to end. Clear, definitive, and legally binding boundaries were no longer optional safeguards. They were essential measures required to protect the monarchy's stability, authority, and ability to function without constant risk of disruption. At the same time, concern began to surface beyond Britain's borders.
By late 2024, diplomatic partners quietly but increasingly expressed unease over the continuing turmoil surrounding the monarchy. What had once been viewed abroad as an internal family matter was now being reassessed through a wider lens, one that considered stability, reliability, and international perception. Senior officials warned that the ongoing uncertainty was beginning to affect Britain's global image and diminish its soft power, an influence carefully built over generations. Although no formal demands or ultimatums were issued, the message carried through diplomatic channels was clear and difficult to ignore. Allies were watching closely, and patience was thinning. The unresolved situation was no longer confined to domestic headlines. It was beginning to register as a factor in how Britain and its institutions were perceived on the world stage. The implication was unmistakable. Prolonged ambiguity was no longer acceptable, and resolution was not merely advisable, it was necessary. For William, who was preparing to inherit a role deeply defined by global diplomacy and international responsibility, these warnings carried profound and lasting weight. Leadership on the world stage depends not only on authority, but on the perception of stability, judgment, and internal cohesion. Any visible doubt about unity within his own family risked evolving into broader doubts about his capacity to lead, mediate, and command confidence beyond Britain's borders.
I want to create a world in which my son is proud of what we do, in a world and a job that actually does impact people's lives for the better.
As family strain intensified, legal risks sharpened, and international pressure steadily mounted, the paths available to him narrowed rapidly. Each factor reinforced the others, closing off the possibility of delay or compromise. In the end, the convergence of these forces left him with no viable alternative. Action was no longer a strategic choice among many. It was the only remaining course capable of preserving authority, credibility, and the future role he was preparing to assume. Prince William's final decision came at a significant personal cost, one that he did not underestimate or take lightly. After months of sustained tension and careful consideration, he reached a painful conclusion. Continued ambiguity was no longer a neutral position. It was actively harming those closest to him, his wife, his children, and his family, while simultaneously weakening the institution he was duty-bound to protect. His statement was not born out of resentment, anger, or a desire to assign blame. It was shaped by responsibility, an acceptance of the weight that comes with leadership and the obligations that accompany it. In choosing clarity over comfort, he acknowledged that some decisions, though deeply personal and emotionally difficult, must be made not for relief, but for stability, protection, and the preservation of something larger than any individual relationship. For Meghan Markle, the announcement marked the definitive end of any remaining connection to royal life. The final door was not merely closed, it was sealed, bringing an unmistakable conclusion to any prospect of return, reintegration, or future role within the institution. With that decision came the termination of access to official support structures, security provisions, and any form of ceremonial or representative involvement tied to the monarchy. Both strategically and symbolically, the separation was absolute. There were no transitional phases, no lingering affiliations, and no ambiguity left to reinterpret. The message was clear. The relationship had reached its endpoint. What once existed as a complex and evolving association was now firmly placed in the past, defined not by ongoing negotiation, but by a clear and deliberate finality that reshaped the boundaries of royal life moving forward. This moment stands as a stark and sobering reminder of the collision between personal relationships and institutional duty, a point where emotion, history, and loyalty are forced to yield to responsibility and structure. In roles defined by leadership, there are moments when preserving every bond becomes impossible without endangering stability itself. Sometimes, the most difficult act of leadership is the acceptance that certain relationships cannot be maintained without undermining the foundations they rest upon. Prince William's statement marked a clear turning point, not only for the royal family, but for the broader question of how enduring institutions confront internal conflict. It demonstrated how boundaries are drawn not out of coldness, but necessity, and how survival often requires clarity where ambiguity once lingered. In choosing finality over fracture, the monarchy revealed a fundamental truth of leadership. Continuity is preserved not by avoiding hard decisions, but by facing them directly and enduring the consequences. If this story changed the way you see royal power, leadership, and the cost of silence, make sure you like this video. It helps more than you realize. And subscribe to the channel for in-depth royal analysis you won't find in headlines. Stories that explain not just what happened, but why it had to happen. Thank you for watching, and stay with us for the stories others hesitate to tell.